And we're back. Let's go ahead and get started on Chapter 6, Sam and the Church. For most Mafia families, growing up in the Catholic Church is part of a tradition that began in the Old Country in Sicily and was brought to Chicago and other regions of America during the Great Migration of Italians in the late 1800s. However, it wasn't that way for me and my sisters. Tradition had nothing to do with it. Sam, even though a feared criminal, wanted religious training, discipline, and values for all of us, and at times he even practiced some of those values himself for the sake of my mother, but it wasn't done out of any sense of tradition. Catholicism wasn't something that Sam grew up with. It was something he grew into, and that in itself is strange. Almost every so-called mafioso I ever met, from Tall the waiter Ricca to Jackie the lackey Cerrone, grew up in families that practiced Catholicism, had a sense of religion and faith. That the sons had strayed to become criminals and mafioso was not so strange in a poverty-stricken environment. This was to some degree traditional. The church had kept its silence about the mafia in Sicily for centuries until Pope John Paul II called on Sicilians to isolate and destroy the mafia, while the Archbishop of Palermo, Salvatore Cardinal Pappalardo, threatened to withhold absolution and other sacraments from suspected mafioso. In Sam's case, his father, Antonio, never attended church, nor did he require his sons to. It wasn't that Grandpa Giancana was against religion. He simply didn't make time for it. He was too busy trying to hustle a buck with his push cart 7 days a week, and when he wasn't working, he was romancing women, both those he married and those he didn't. So the values of the church and of God were lost on Sam until he met my mother, a deeply religious woman from a deeply religious family. Even as a child, Mother went to church, to Mass, daily to pray. She prayed for a lot of things, for her own forgiveness and whatever sins she thought she might have committed, for her mother and father and her brothers and sisters. And when she married Sam, she went to Mass daily to pray for him, for his deliverance, for his safety, for forgiveness for him and for her children. This is not untypical of the wives of the older mafiosi. For centuries, they have been in church praying for their sinning husbands. It was because of Mother that Sam showed more than just a tolerance of religion. He showed, however silently, within the confines of his family and his home, a sense of religious values that he wanted his daughters to learn and to follow. Some of us tried. In the end, I failed. When courting my mother, Sam was smart enough to realize that the Titolves would not permit their daughter to marry a heathen. She had been schooled all her young life as a Catholic, and it was certainly that Angelina de Tolve was not going to be married or bear children outside the church. If Sam wanted Angeline badly enough, he would have to conform, or at least compromise. And he did. My father and mother were married in a traditional Roman Catholic ceremony, and for a time, Sam went to Mass with her. For a time. By the time I was old enough to attend church with Mother, Sam had long since changed his attendance habits. He was down to going to church twice a year, at Christmas and at Easter. There were exceptions, funerals of mob friends and relatives, or weddings, but that was pretty much it. But when he did go, he looked elegant. I remember particularly his attending Mass with Mother and Bonnie and me in Florida, at St. Patrick's in Miami Beach, where Bonnie was later married. Wherever he went, he looked like someone in a Fortune 500 executive photograph. A hat, always a hat, perhaps a fedora, sometimes a fashionable and expensive straw hat. Tailored suits and white shirts with carefully selected ties, and cufflinks, solid gold or with sapphires or black onyx, and later, as the money flowed more easily, cufflinks with his initials in diamonds. Then there were his shoes, beautiful, expensive shoes, brightly polished so you could see your reflection in them, unless they were white, and then they were spotlessly white. He could have been mistaken for the president of General Motors. Funny, the corporation he headed probably had bigger annual profits than General Motors, and they were tax-free. At least no one paid taxes on them. Inside the church, he was flawless in following the Mass, and if he had done it as if he had done it every day of his life. He would kneel and pray at the proper moments, reciting the Our Father prayer, the Apostles' Creed, and Latin verses, and I remember wondering how he did it. I think my father believed in God. He violated all the rules of the church and of God. He ordered murders, he lied, he cheated, he jumped into more women, into bed with more women than I can count, but still I know he believed. 2 incidents come to mind. The first was when my mother went into the hospital for a hysterectomy. While she was in surgery, I vividly remember seeing him on his knees in a chapel, tears streaming down his face, hands clasped together, praying for her safety. The second incident involved my sister Francine, who from the moment of her birth had been courted by death. She was so small when she was born that her eyes were damaged, and there was a time that we all thought, the doctors thought, that she would become legally blind. In 1954, not long after my mother's death, I had been making novenas at St. Jude's on Ashland Avenue in Chicago. The church was also a Dominican Father's shrine to St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes, and at a special time of the year, relics of St. Jude were taken out of the scarcity and placed on the afflicted portion of a believer's body. Sam, though distraught over my mother's death, knew I was making novenas for her at St. Jude's. I told him about the special power of the relics. Sam's eyes were misty as he looked at me and listened. The relics. They bring them out this week, I said. Maybe, if I bring Franny, maybe the power of St. Jude will help restore her sight. To my complete surprise, Sam nodded in agreement. Maybe you're right, he said. Go ahead and take her. And I did. Sam stood in the back of the church watching the ceremony, watching them place the relics on Francine's closed eyes, praying over her. Then it was over, and Francine returned home, and though her eyes remained slightly crossed, her vision improved gradually from that point on. Now she no longer requires thick eyeglasses, or lives with the threat of an eye operation that might leave her blind. She sees through contact lenses. Was it a miracle? A spiritual cure? I like to think so, and I know Sam was convinced it helped. Publicly, Sam rarely showed an interest in the church. That might have been construed as a sign of weakness by his underlings, the men whom he ordered to eliminate others. Yet there were other signs of his belief, signs that I grew up with as a child and knew, even as my mother did, a strange paradox. From the time I was old enough to kneel and say my prayers at bedside, I can remember my father coming home at night when he wasn't in prison, sitting at the table, bowing his head, and clasping his hands in prayer as my mother said grace over each meal. It was not something that only my mother did. Sam wanted her to do it, and he participated. Why, as head of the household, did he not say grace himself? I can only surmise. Perhaps it was because of embarrassment. Perhaps he knew his criminal acts defiled God. But he did require that grace be said before anyone touched a morsel of food. He also followed other church traditions. No meat was to be eaten on Fridays or on Christmas Eve or on Good Friday. And each of his daughters had to get the best possible training in Catholic parochial schools that was available, whether we liked it or not. I'm not certain whether that was simply to shelter us from recurrent press reports of his criminal activity or to provide us with the religious background and education that he lacked. Dad had never had the luxury of attending a parochial school. I know that in my early formative years, I was difficult for my mother to handle, but I think now that was only part of the reason for sending me off to Catholic boarding school, first as a child of 5 and later as a teenager. It became apparent later that Sam wanted a nun in his family. If there could be no priest, a nun would be just fine, and I was sent to be that nun. My first inkling that Catholic boarding school was to become a way of life for me came in September 1940, when Sam was serving time in federal prison for bootlegging. One Sunday afternoon, I walked into my room and saw my mother sewing name tapes on my clothes, my towels, my linen, everything I owned, and packing them up into a suitcase on top of my bed. "What are you doing, Mama?" I asked. "I'm getting your things ready for school," she answered softly. I looked at the clothes she was packing, and they looked so strange. I remember thinking, those aren't my clothes. I don't wear clothes like that. Instead of gay, frilly dresses, there were blue dresses with crisp white collars, the uniforms of the parochial school and convent where I was being sent. I remember stepping from the car belonging to my uncle, Michael de Tolve, and looking up at an ominous, massive building and a convent with a chapel. Suddenly I was frightened, overwhelmed by the size of it all. The school was, of course, very neat. The grounds were well kept, with pretty flowers and shrubs and green manicured lawns, but the school was frightening nonetheless, and even more so when I saw Mother hand my suitcase to a nun as we stood in the huge reception room. Mother knelt to hug and kiss me goodbye. At that moment I went berserk. I screamed and cried. I ranted and raved. I stamped my feet on the floor in a rage and screamed out at the top of my lungs. "I won't stay here! You can't make me stay here!" I shouted. "I won't! I won't! You can't make me!" Then I kicked the nun hard in the shins. Startled, she cried out in pain and released my hand, and I ran toward my mother, who was walking toward the front door. "Mama, Mama, please don't leave, please!" I cried, holding onto her skirt. Firmly, she pulled my hand away, shaking her head. "It's for the best, Annette," she said. "You'll be home again soon. You'll see. Be a good girl. Be a good girl for Mama." I had a difficult time at Resurrection Academy. In the beginning, I hated it. I hated my mother for leaving me. I hated my father for encouraging her to send me there while he was away at college. I hated the nuns, and I hated the discipline and regimen they forced on us daily. I lived in a bare, drab dormitory that might have qualified as army barracks were it not for the crosses with Christ image hanging over each of the 15 beds. The beds were small, not big, soft, roomy beds with headboards like those at home. They were more like cots lined up neatly in a row. Next to each bed was a very small bureau, and outside in the hall was a little locker-type closet where we hung our clothes. Each day we were required to wear blue uniforms with stiff white collars and white cuffs, long white stockings and black shoes that had to be shined every day. Sunday the dress routine changed only slightly. We wore spotless white uniforms because it was a day we had to look pure, like little angels for the Lord. School began very early in the morning with a 7 a.m. Mass. To be ready for that service, we were awakened at 6. We had to wash, dress carefully, make our beds, and put away our night clothes neatly. Just before marching off to Mass, we were required to stand in sections outside our room while the nuns walked slowly around us and inspected us, checking our hands, our faces, behind and inside our ears. Sometimes a student would have a little dirt behind her ears or on her hand. The nun would order the offending girl to hold out her hand, and down came the ruler. We would all wince even before the sound of the ruler cracking down on her knuckles echoed in the hallway. After Mass in chapel, we were marched to the Academy's dining hall for a rather sparse and always hurried breakfast. Classes began promptly at 9 a.m., where we remained, except for a short luncheon break, until 5 p.m. I did not adjust at all well to the routine. Having been thoroughly spoiled at home, I had no idea what discipline really was. I was lonely and I was afraid, and except for rare weekends once each month, I never saw my mother or sisters. From the beginning, I had a problem. I wet my bed. I had never done this at home, but now at school I did. The nuns had a quick solution for such nonsense. Every night while other children watched, I would have to take off my sheet, carry it to the laundry room, wash it by hand in a tub, and rinse it out while one of the nuns watched sternly. I would then have to hang it up to dry over the radiator. Later in the night, a nun would return, wake me up again, take me back to the laundry to get my sheet, and then make me make my bed. Everyone in the dormitory made fun of me, taunting me. If it weren't for one particularly compassionate nun, Sister Roberta, I'm not sure I would have made it through those early years. Sister Roberta had soft brown eyes, a soothing voice, and a profound compassion for others, and there was a silent, almost telepathic communication between us that enabled her to sense when I was in trouble. She would often help me with my sheets, and she made sure that I ate properly, that I wore my glasses, and as I was frequently ill, she would always be there by my side in the infirmary, holding my hand, wiping my fevered brow, saying softly, "Sleep, my little Annetka, sleep. God loves you as I do." That almost telepathic sense she had of my danger was demonstrated when on one occasion she undoubtedly saved my life. I was in the dormitory hallway, alone, not far from my room, when I began hemorrhaging from my nose. It wasn't a normal nosebleed because I was choking on my own blood, unable to cry out for help. Sister Roberta was in chapel praying. She recalled later that a strange feeling came over her and that all at once she had a vision of what was happening to me. She jumped up, asked for God's help, and ran from the chapel to the hallway where I was choking, crying out her special nickname for me. "Annetka, my Annetka, where are you?" When she found me, I was covered with blood, gasping for breath, and terribly frightened. She scooped me up and ran with me to the infirmary, where doctors were able to stop the bleeding. I did require transfusions, and later I was told that if she had not found me, I very likely would have choked to death in the hallway. It was my closeness to Sister Roberta that convinced me at a very early age that I wanted to become a nun, and after the bleeding incident, religion became a part of me. Up to that point, I had been a terrible student, the first in the memory of the Resurrection nuns to flunk the first grade. Then suddenly, I began appearing daily in chapel on my own, making the Stations of the Cross, reciting the prayers of the Rosary, not once, but twice, even 3 times a day. There were several small grottos at the academy, but I favored one called the Dark Grotto, and visited it frequently. There I would pray as hard as I could that God would help me become a nun, like Sister Roberta. On May 10th, 1942, with my father still away, I finally qualified to make my first Holy Communion. My mother, my aunts, and my uncles, my sister Bonnie, and Sister Roberta were there smiling at me as I walked down the aisle of the chapel and knelt in front of the priest to receive communion. For me, it was a theatrical event. For Sam, who was still away in prison, it was a moment he made certain I would always remember. Fat Leonard had been dispatched to our home with a special envelope weeks earlier so that I could have the finest of everything that day, a day he would see only in photographs sent to him. My hair was carefully curled and combed. My communion dress was of the best quality with lace, flowered sleeves, mother-of-pearl buttons. I also wore a solid gold medal and sterling silver and pearl, real pearl, rosaries. My hair was covered by a delicate soft veil with a fern design on the lace headdress. I was the picture of purity, a little angel of God. After the ceremony, relatives, close friends, nuns, religious leaders, politicians my family knew, all gathered at our home to present me with expensive gifts of cash and jewelry, and to congratulate me. The tables groaned with food and wine and delicacies, and my purse was filled with envelopes, all of them containing money, several thousands of dollars, which my mother kept. The religious education that began in those early years at my father's orders was to continue as I progressed in age and aptitude, and Sam was not the least bit reluctant to use his money to get me accepted by the finest religious academies, including Ladywood, a finishing school for girls in Indianapolis. It was here, ironically, that I finally turned away from the church. His direction was always toward preparing me to become a nun, perhaps to atone for his sins in some way. Although Sam attended church rarely, he did like to spend hours examining old churches, not necessarily Catholic ones. In New York City, for example, I was with him when he sought out and attended Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral. But there were other churches he made a point of visiting: St. Bartholomew's, the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, St. John the Baptist, and other smaller ones, all steeped in historical significance. He loved to visit them all. Sam was also exceedingly generous to the church. When he did attend Mass, he always put several $100s in the envelope, whether we were in Florida or at our regular parish, St. Bernardine's Catholic Church in Forest Park, Illinois. At St. Bernardine's, he also had very close personal relationships with a Monsignor and a parish priest, visiting them often or having them to his home for long private talks before and after Mother's death. From the time that Francine went to school with a cousin, Andrea Perno, at St. Bernardine's, Sam was an especially generous contributor to that parish, and he gave heavily also to St. Francis of Rome and Cicero, donations that were made primarily through my mother. Even the FBI took note of one of Sam's donations in one of its communications to J. Edgar Hoover from the Chicago office. The air telegram to the director, dated September 25, 1961, was the daily summary of my father's activities. Apparently, the FBI had interviewed someone at St. Bernardine's. The name of the person interviewed was blanked out. And this is a quote from that. Daily summary, blanked out subject, Giancana, is parishioner belonging to St. Bernardine Church, however, never attends Sunday Masses. Claimed subject, upon death of wife, Angeline, during April 1954, donated communion rail for church and wife's memory at cost of $13,000. Later, donated 6 stained glass windows at cost of $150. That's the end of the quote. The communique ended with the notation, Giancana, armed and dangerous, a cautionary phrase the FBI used in all its memorandums about my father, although in all the time I was with Sam, I never saw him carry a weapon of any kind. The donated communion rail the FBI referred to is now gone. The railing was made of exquisite marble. After its removal, it was cut in sections and placed in front of statues of saints throughout the church. The memorial plaque was removed after Sam was assassinated. The final irony was supplied by the late Cardinal Cody. When my family wanted to have services for Sam in his parish and donate money in his memory, They were turned down on orders of Cardinal Cody in the Chancery. He was, however, buried in holy ground at Mount Carmel Cemetery, but only because the family mausoleum was there. When the FBI listed the items found in our home after Sam's assassination, among the most treasured items that had been locked in his desk was a photograph of a private audience he had had with Pope Pius XII, a scroll commemorating that audience at the Vatican, a bottle of water from the River Jordan, 2 solid gold rosaries, and a plain rosary, like the ones he had made for each of his daughters. Those rosaries had been fashioned from the roses of my mother's funeral and preserved. There were other artifacts, statues of the infant Jesus, of St. Anthony, his favorite saint, of Christ, of the Holy Family. He had them all. They were the spiritual reminders he kept about him that only his family knew about, not his friends. There were also sometimes anonymous contributions of huge sums of money. I remember a private school, the Providence School for Retarded Children, to which Sam donated a huge stained glass window as well as cash in the name of my mother's mother. And there was an entire room, as well as stained glass windows, given to Columbus Hospital in memory of Grandpa DeTolve. There were many, many others. It wasn't that Sam was trying to buy his way into heaven. He knew better than that. He was showing respect for my mother, and without broadcasting it to his peers in the underworld, acknowledging that he had grown to believe in something besides violence and death and the ugliness of the Mafia. End of chapter.